So, we want to talk about standing alone and choosing sides. We're talking, aren't we, about those fears that loom giant-like in almost all of our lives. Those fears that are no more or less real than the giants faced by the faithful down throughout the eras. No less dangerous than Og was to Moses. No less formidable than Goliath was to David. And in all of the cases of the brethren who faced giants, they faced something that was existential. It had the chance, the power to remove their faith and take them away from salvation. And the giants they faced, yes, they were physical, but underneath the skin, when you boil it down, there was something else going on, wasn't there? In Moses' case, he faced fear, yes, but also old age and those creeping impacts of time. In David's case, he faced doubt and worry that perhaps maybe God was not as powerful as he believed. Maybe God wasn't even real. And in the lives of all of these faithful men, when you boil it down, it wasn't the giant himself that was the problem. It was what was going on in their minds. And what we're going to see tonight, we're going to consider a man who faced a terrible choice. And it appears that he was willing to stand up to the greatest giant in history, the biggest, the toughest, the meanest of them all. All of the giants, it seems, trace their lineage back to the dead giants before the flood. As we saw in our first session together, the general term for the giants was not a description of giantism at all, but rather a word that means the dead ones, the walking shades of the long dead monsters. People viewed the giants who lived in their time as the reanimated corpses of the giants who died in the flood, the Nephilim, the Gibborim of Noah's day. And we're going to meet in this session Nimrod. And Nimrod's a man who stands head and shoulders above all of these other giants. He takes his cue right from the mighty giants before the flood, those men of renown. And even though he too has now been dead 4,000 years or so, the tower that Nimrod built still casts a shadow. People still cite the example of Nimrod as something that is good, something that is admirable, and something that is powerful. And the kingdom that he established, we know from Bible prophecy, it lives on. Its kings are inspired by Nimrod's greatness, by what Nimrod achieved. Of all the giants, none has been so significant. None changed history like Nimrod did. And we want to look tonight briefly at the man who faced him. The hero of faith who risked isolation, who risked exclusion, hatred, perhaps even death to rebuke this giant. He's a man we believe his name is Eber. So Genesis 10, we've just had part of that chapter read for us, and well, obviously Genesis 10 is the chapter after Genesis 9, which is the end of the story of Noah and the flood. It's the what happens next chapter, isn't it? The PS, if you like, the coda to the end of the flood that drowned the whole planet. And while when we read it in our daily readings, it can sometimes feel like just this list of names of people who don't mean a lot to us, it conceals the stories of these two people, Nimrod and Eber, the giant and his enemy. Genesis chapter 9, Noah and the other 7 leave the ark. They step into a pristine new world, a world disinfected by God himself, unstained now by the crimes of the Nephilim. But before long, as we know, the lessons of the flood are going to be forgotten. Or more pointedly, it's not that they're going to be forgotten. The lessons of the flood will be actively rejected as men began to rage against the constraints of a life lived, a life of faith. The constraints of a life of service. And they began to chafe against a life lived under the rainbow. And for some of us, that last phrase might seem a little odd, a little strange. A life to chafe against a life lived under the rainbow. Because, you see, the rainbow given in Genesis chapter 9 was given to mark God's solemn, personal promise to never again destroy all life with a flood. It was a beautiful symbol of an eternal covenant, of divine care. And yet it seems that to many, it became a symbol of God's watchful eye, a little bit like this. Might mean something to those who love the classics, who love Tolkien. A terrifying, watching, divine eye. And each time the clouds built up and the rain fell, those people who felt this way would feel threatened and fearful. And each time they saw the rainbow, they would be grudgingly compelled to live a life that they didn't want to, lest clouds come again in anger. They wanted to live their lives as they wanted, just the way they wanted, and yet, no doubt, they felt threatened and fearful by this vast, multi-hued eye in the sky watching them. And you might think, well, this is a really strange connection to make, but do you know what? We know they felt that way. Because across the globe, legends linger on. The Hondurans, for example, they see the rainbow as a symbol of the devil's anger. Now, this is probably too small for most of you to read, but it talks about their lord of the region of death, the king of Hades, and he is seen as a rainbow in the west occasionally. And when they see him, they're fearful. They won't go to work. They perform all sorts of rituals to avoid the watchful eye of the God of the rainbow, the God of the dead. The Karens of Burma see the rainbow as a symbol of impending evil from the king of hell. And their legends, ancient and confused as they are, that they are still confused memories of the flood. And they fear that God will judge them again. In many of these, you can hear a tone of oppression, a sense that they saw God as angry and vindictive, that he was a dictatorial God demanding things of them that they did not wish to give. And here in these old myths are these stories that remember the flood and how they felt about the God who put the rainbow in the heavens. To me, one of the clearest stories, one of the clearest memories, if you like, of the events after the flood and how people felt about them is this one, collected by a missionary in the Pacific Islands. And we won't go through it word for word, but fundamentally it describes that the Pacific Islanders believed they lived in a world at the beginning where the sky was so low that it crushed them under its weight and they had to crawl across the surface of the earth until a hero emerged, who by a great effort was able to lift the sky on his shoulders till finally he could walk. And then by further effort, he was able to lift the sky to the height of a palm tree. And finally, he managed to lift the sky back to where it belongs in the heavens, pushing it away from the people. And he was he was lauded and worshipped as the elevator of the heavens, a hero of the people in these Pacific islands. And buried in the memory of these races are fragments of the flood. And of a picture that sees God not as a loving deity who gave the rainbow as a promise of his care, but completely the opposite, of God as oppressive and angry, weighing them down like a low-hanging sky, and of the elevator of the heavens who saved them all, Nimrod. So Genesis 10, it records names. They're the descendants of Noah, aren't they? His children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and so on. It's whose son was who and where did they end up. It's the lineage of the nations. And among these, there would have been some, no doubt, who strove to keep walking with God, while others wanted to walk away, to be freed from God. It's a chapter with lots of names and places, isn't it? But of all those names, of all the people we're introduced to in Genesis 10, there's only 2 names that we're given any more than their name. There's only 2 names that we have any real narrative wrapped around them in Genesis 10 itself. It's full of names, but only 2 give us some history. And in both instances, something interesting happens in the way they are described. The ancestor of the person we are interested in, the patriarch of their family line, is distinguished by their descendant rather than the other way around. Look at verse 8, for example. And Cush begat Nimrod. Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. Cush begat Nimrod. Okay, what are you saying? Well, the thing is, Cush didn't. He didn't beget Nimrod. The sons of Cush are listed in verse 7 and Nimrod's not among them. Because the word beget here, well, it comes from a different tense in the Hebrew. And when in one tense, the tense we would commonly feel like this word should be used, the word begat means actual paternity. But in verse 8, where it says Cush begat Nimrod, the tenses there indicate not so much paternity, but lineage. It's saying that Nimrod was in the line of Cush. Or more to the point, the line of Cush was distinctive, for in it arose Nimrod, the giant of the age. And we'll see a similar thing when we get to look at Eber. So who was this Nimrod? Well, we can see from what we've read, he was a descendant of Ham. Ham was, we believe, the father of many of the African races, and in fact, Cush's name means black. And we're told that in verse 8, this man began to be a mighty one in the earth. That would be better translated, not so much began as he was the first on earth. Not began, but was the first one to do something. He was the beginner of a particular thing. And the thing he was the beginner of was, well, being a mighty man. So it says ESV, RSV, Jerusalem Bible, and a bunch of other translations. So he was the first to be a mighty one. Is that good or bad? Well, because of where this is placed in the Bible, we have no doubt. Because you see, Moses has only got previous chapters as precedents to go on. The only precedent for a mighty one so far in the Bible, for Moses to draw on and to inform us as to what he means by mighty one, is somewhere we've already been. It's Genesis chapter 6. Because in Genesis chapter 6, the mighty ones, the Hagiborim, the mighty heroes, those Nephilim of the age before, they had, through their deeds and their thoughts, condemned the world to its cataclysm. and they died in the flood. The Nephilim, Gibborim. And so here in Noah's new world, the first of an old breed of mighty godless men emerges. That's what we're being told here. He began to be a mighty man. He was the first of the Gibborim again. And verse 9 tells us that he wasn't just a mighty man. He wasn't just a powerful hero as seen by those around him. No, he was more than that. He was a powerful man of influence due to his prowess as a hunter, a mighty hunter. I think, a hunter. Righto. How many hunters who are global influencers do you know? It's not a particularly PC career these days, is it? But, that's not really a problem, is it? Did you know there's not one positive example of a hunter in the Bible? The hunters in the Bible are bad. And he's not just a hunter, he's a mighty hunter. You think, well, what's the difference between a hunter and a mighty hunter? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's the prey. That's the difference between any old hunter. Dan the hunter manages by the might of his strength to chase down the mouse that has been plaguing his pantry. I'm mighty, look at me roar. But this was not this man. Nimrod was so much more than that. He trapped and slew the greatest of prey, the wiliest, the most savage, the most brutally intelligent of all the beasts. And of course, we know which is the mightiest, the greatest predator right at the top of the food chain, don't we? It's men. It's people. And the root word for hunt that's used here, it's used almost exclusively of those who hunt human prey. And clearly this was the case. It was by hunting that his kingdom was established. The Hebrew here describes the hunting and the kingdom as a cause and effect. His hunting of men made him a mighty, powerful, influential person in the earth. In fact, such a mighty hunter was he that people living in Moses' time remembered his exploits. Verse 9 says, wherefore it is said, it was a proverb. Everybody, you know that proverb. Everybody knows. Even as Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the earth, it had become proverbial. The might and the power of this man. Like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before God. Before God. That means in the face of God, and not in a good way. Nimrod got in God's face, much as Korah's men got in Moses' face in Numbers 16 verse 2. The Septuagint for this particular little phrase says against God. He was a mighty hunter against Yahweh. A mighty man in a bad way. A hunter of men. And almost every dictionary agrees on this point in particular, that Nimrod's name itself means rebellion, or we will rebel. So, was this man a causeless rebel? A nonconformist? A sort of ancient James Dean? No, he was a rebel against God himself. Keelan Delich, one of the commentators, writes this: the name itself, Nimrod, comes from a Hebrew term, we will revolt, and it points to some violent resistance to God. It is so characteristic that it can only have been given by his contemporaries and thus have become a proper name. And so here's the 12-cubit question: was Nimrod a giant? I mean, clearly he was gifted with physical prowess that enabled him to build a kingdom around his personal gifts, his personal might. And as we've already noted, He began to be a mighty man, a Gibberim, a hero. And that word is used of both the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6 and also of Goliath later on in 1 Samuel 17. But it is also used of many other mighty men who weren't giants. The Septuagint translates verse 8 thusly. And Cuz begat Nimrod. He began to be a giant upon the earth. To my mind, none of this is compelling evidence that he actually was a physical giant. But I think we can safely say he became a giant of sorts. Firstly, in the eyes of his contemporaries, he became the biggest, the most important man, a titan in politics, in religion, and in warfare. Much like the giants of industry today, and this is a very old newspaper article, but it makes the point perfectly, talking of business leaders who fell from grace as giants who fell to the earth. We know what it means to be a titan of business, a giant on a particular stage or platform, a superstar. Much like these individuals, like the Elon Musks and the Donald Trumps and all the rest, Nimrod cast a long shadow and he built an empire that lasts till our era and beyond. But secondly, in verse 8, we were told that he was the first to be a mighty one. Well, clearly he wasn't the first in the sense of time because, well, the Nephilim were mighty ones before him. There'd been mighty ones already. So it's not saying he was the first to come up with this great idea of being a mighty one. What it's saying is he was the first in rank. He became the top-ranked mighty one, the first on the leaderboard of dictators and strongmen and tyrants. In fact, the ancient memory of Nimrod and the stories that surround him were copied out of the traditions in the area in which he lived, and they spread all around the world. Many cultures and races picked up on this idea of Nimrod as a giant, so much so that when the Greeks came along 1,000 years later to start writing their epics, they identified the mighty hunter in their stories as Orion, the constellation otherwise known as the giant. And Orion is mentioned in the oldest of Greek literature, dating all the way back to 800 BC. They describe him as a hunter with hounds, a giant hunter pursuing its prey. In Arabic literature, the same constellation is Al-Jabbar, which just means the giant. And so, Nimrod may not have been a giant like Og or Goliath, but in ambition and in achievement and in ungodly empire building, he towered above them all. And verse 10 tells us that the start of his empire was Babel. And that's the story of Genesis chapter 11, isn't it? An empire that started through his accomplishments as a manhunter, a rebel, and a man of renown. In fact, there's 3 fields of endeavor in which he became top dog. The military, the religious, and the political spheres all bowed before him in unison. And so he started with Babel, or Babylon, the gate of God, as it means in Babylonian. But that wasn't the end of what he did, because he went out from there, verse 11, into Asher and built Nineveh. And the next few verses in the Hebrew they're really hard to sort of disentangle, but some of the better commentators suggest that the next few words should be read as Nineveh, which is a most vast city. In fact, not a most vast city, the most vast city. He built several other cities, but his epitaph here is that he built Razin between Nineveh and Calais, all of which combined to make the mega city, the great city that was Nineveh. And as I said, it wasn't a great city. At the time, it was the great city. This man built Babylon, and when that project was stopped by God himself, he built the great city. A city made of 3 parts: Rezin, Calais, and Nineveh. And 4,000 years later, what Nimrod started with Babylon and perfected in Nineveh, only after those 4,000 years have passed, only then will the thing that he built finally fall. Genesis 11 tells the story of the building of Babel. And look, it's clear from that story, lots of people were involved. Everybody was involved in building Babel. Afterwards, you could tell the story, I did the stairs on the way up. That's why there's a little bit of a dent on the edge. I dropped one of the limestone bricks. They didn't notice at the time. They were too busy arguing about what language they were speaking. Lots of people were involved, yes. But Genesis 10 confirms for us that it was Nimrod who was the architect of Babylon. He was the thought leader who made it happen. And in verse 4 of chapter 11, we're given an idea about what was going on in the people's minds, and particularly in Nimrod's mind, as he began this work, building this city, Babylon, the gate of God. And it tells us that there were several goals in building this tower. They said, let us build a city and a tower. What for? Well, whose top may reach unto the heavens, and we want to make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth. So firstly, they wanted to reach heaven. They wanted to wrest control over their lives away from the God of the rainbow. They wanted to let a man stand in the heavens, someone who was approachable, perhaps even bribable, and let him stand in the heavens and take on God on their behalf, and having replaced God, let him rule over them. And you will note that word where it says, if you've got an Oxford Bible, that whose top may reach, that may reach is in italics in an Oxford Bible, because, well, it's not in the original. It's applied to make sense of the sentence. But when we really dig into what that phrase is trying to say, it could be that it's trying to tell us that this was a tower whose top is heaven. And we're told that the Tower of Babel was called the Gate of Heaven. And it suggested that at the top of this tower, it was adorned with the horoscope. What's the horoscope? Well, it's man's attempt to predict and control his destiny using the stars. I'm sure none of you have ever read your own horoscope, but I did just once. Mars is rising in the house of Venus. Today is a great day for Vegemite sandwiches. I was sold. I'm glad someone smiled. Thank you for that. Very, very kind of you to laugh at such a poor joke. But people use horoscopes and have used horoscopes for a very long time because it gives them a sense of control in what seems like an uncontrolled and cruel and capricious world. And this was no different. Perhaps they hoped to wrest control, or at least predictive control, of the world around them away from God by using the stars. Now, whatever it was, Nimrod clearly planned to dethrone God. And the other goal was to make a name. And the Hebrew word there for name, well, it's pretty significant when you think about it, because it's the word Shem. I think this is the biblical version of a Freudian slip. Nimrod planned to replace Shem, and we know who Shem was. He was the priest of the Most High God, the spiritual leader of the family of Noah. And he planned to enthrone himself on high, establishing himself both as high priest and as deity in one. In other words, he was going to replace the God of the rainbow with a God who they understood, a God who would let them do what they wanted. Josephus wrote of this man that he persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, but to believe it was their own courage which procured that happiness. And that feels like really modern language to me for a man alive in AD 70. Nimrod, though a godless tyrant, promoted the fiction that happiness is something we can achieve. Happiness is something gotten through what we do. It's not due to God's goodness, oh no, but due to our own efforts. And sometimes I hear the language of Nimrod in the ecclesia and it scares me. I want to live my best life. I want to be my best self. Come across to Colossians chapter 3, please. This is a digression of sorts, I know, but I think it's so important in a post-truth world where everybody is trying to live their own truth, be their own person, find themselves. Colossians 3, verse 2. The apostle says to the brothers and sisters at Colossae, set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead. You're dead. And your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then at that time shall ye also appear with him in glory. And sometimes you'll meet people and they say, you haven't got a life, you just have to live. And well, actually, you know what? We don't. Our life is with Christ. And when someone says to you, you haven't got a life, that's a compliment, brothers and sisters. It's an absolute compliment. Wear that. But Nimrod said, you'll be happy when you get rich. You'll be happy when you lose 5 kilograms. You'll be happy when you get that degree you always thought you should have got. You'll be happy when you finished my tower. And he promoted a focus on self, a very modern perspective of self-empowerment, self-glorification. He was a giant of humanity devoted to banishing God, empowering sinners, and glorifying self. And he set up a system of society that now almost completely and totally fills our globe. He was one of the most modern men in the Bible. So what about Eber? Well, back to Genesis 10, verse 21, because that's where Eber first shows up. Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born, the children of Shem, and off we go. You see, just as Cush was distinguished by his connection to a descendant, not a son, but a descendant, Nimrod, Shem is here distinguished from all of the other Shems that you might meet out there by being the ancestor of Eber. Oh, you know Shem? No, not the one with the corner store, the one who's the dad of the great-grandfather of Eber. That Shem. So who was this Eber and why was he so important? Why is he mentioned here out of sequence in his history? He's not going to be born till verse 24. He's the great-grandson of Shem. What makes him more important than Salah or Arphaxad? Well, verse 25 tells us that he had 2 sons, and he named one of them Peleg. Peleg means to split. It means division or an earthquake even. For it appears that soon after the birth of this little boy, an event tore the world apart. An event so significant and so dramatic that Eber named his son after this event. It was the violent division of the world after the events of Babel, wasn't it? When God confused humanity and introduced a babel of competing languages overnight. Division, divided. A world split into competing camps. A situation from which it has never yet escaped. But of course, just naming your son something clever hardly qualifies as an event worthy of attention. Certainly not the attention given here to Eber. The Shem was famous because he was Eber's ancestor. So what did he do? Really, the only clue we have to what this man did is in his name. Eber. It means beyond, to have crossed over to the other side. And just as Nimrod was doubtless given his name by contemporaries to signify the thing that he did, rebellion against God, so also I think Eber. I think that what made Eber worthy of notice is that he picked a side, the other side. You might think, well, to who? Well, to Nimrod, of course. Because there was no other side. Until Eber, there was only Nimrod's side. We're told that verse 1 of chapter 11, the whole earth was of one language, of one speech. They all decided, all together, to build a tower. First, there was only one side. And then Eber picked a side. And in the face of a violent man, a hunting, godless rebel, a man who had the whole world in the palm of his hand at that point in time, Eber publicly chose the other side, and he did it alone. It appears that everyone, as we've already said, was on board with Nimrod's God replacement plan. One language, one speech. They're all on the same page. And you know, that phrase, speech, talks about the thought process, the subjects of communication. And the whole world, we're being told, had one language, one mind, so much so that in verse 6, God says, the people are one. One in their plan to build Babel, a gateway for their new God to enter the world. But not Eber. He made a stand and he crossed over. He made a choice, and he made it so obviously, so clearly articulated was it, that it changed everybody's memory of him. Eber, that's right. He's the one who changed sides. In fact, his stand was so significant that when Moses wrote the record of the children of Shem, 9 generations, thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of descendants. Of all of those descendants, the one that Moses flagged as the best reflection of the character of Shem's family, the mascot of the family of Shem, the blessed of Yahweh, it was Eber. The one who changed sides and left Team Nimrod. I want us to realize what a terrifying giant of a choice this one was. All the world, the whole earth was one, marching as it was to the drumbeat of Nimrod. This was not a stand that could be overlooked in an age of general nonconformity. It wasn't like deciding I'm going to have a spinning wheel in the age of Spotlight and Kmart. Oh, you rebel. Nor was Eber's stand like, and I don't know if you remember, but Israel Folau's stand. Risky, yes. Career limiting, potentially. But still one that many would agree with and in the privacy of their own homes nod and say, yes, he did the right thing. But not life-threatening. What Eber did was he said no to a merciless hunter of men, a giant of divine rebellion, a man so violent and so powerful that thousands of years later, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, even the Pacific Islanders remember him as a giant hunter, no, a god. This would be more like standing up to Mr. Putin, knowing that your next step would likely be off a 9th floor balcony. The fear of standing alone and dying for your faith is what Eber faced. Sin in giant form threatened the truth. And at that point in time, at that place where they were, only Eber crossed over. And because of this act of faithful courage, Shem himself became known as the ancestor of Eber's children, the children of the one who separated himself from the whole world. So who were his children? Well, here's one. There came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, a descendant of Eber. Have you ever looked up the word Hebrew in Strong's? That's Strong's. Why was Abraham a true child of Eber? Why was Abraham an Eberu? Well, he separated himself from didn't he? And all it stood for, and crossed over. Oh, he's a child of Eber. Or Genesis chapter 39, verse 14. Joseph, a young man described as an Eberu. And what did he do? What made him a Hebrew? He separated himself from his brother's sins, even when no one was watching. And he chose the other side. He chose the other way. There aren't that many Hebrews in the Bible, not many named Hebrews, but here's another one. Jonah said when he was asked by the men on the ship, why was God sending the storm that he sent? And he said, I am a Hebrew, a son of Eber. Why did Jonah say this? You know, chronologically, the last time someone was called a Hebrew, prior to Jonah saying this, David was not yet crowned king. That name's been out of circulation for a long time. And Jonah resurrects it. Why does he bring it up? Well, because he's on his way to the great city, the home of Nimrod, to stand against all it stood for once more. And of course, there's one more, isn't there? One who truly crossed over and picked a side, who stood utterly alone against the giants of sin and of death. And it's this one, this descendant of Shem, who will finally defeat history's greatest giant. Come to Micah chapter 5. Final quote. Our Hebrew, the champion between the camps, separated from sinners. Of him we're told in verse 1, page 1130 if you've got an Oxford. Now gather yourself together, gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He's laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the tree. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, out of you will come forth unto me the one that will be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. Here he is. He is the Messiah. Here is the King. And it says in verse 4, he shall stand and feed in the strength of Yahweh and the majesty of the name of Yahweh as God, and they shall abide. For now shall he finally be great unto the ends of the earth, and this man shall be our peace, the peace, when the Assyrian shall come into our land. And when that Assyrian shall tread in our palaces, then will we raise against the Assyrians 7 shepherds and 8 principal men, and they, our principal shepherds and our principal men, led by our Lord. They shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall our champion deliver us from the Assyrian when the Assyrian comes into our land. And so as we wait for our champion, our king, our world is increasingly filled with Nimrods, isn't it? It's increasingly filled with people who have the same attitude. And we are being asked to cross over and take a side. It's hard to stand alone in a world that proclaims that tolerance, openness to someone else's truth, any choice, any lifestyle, that is the highest virtue of them all, declare our modern day Nimrods. But it's not, is it? It's the virtue of a giant who strove to depose God. And when we stand, brothers and sisters, even if alone and at great personal cost for God's values, we once again declare God to be right. And at least for some people, we will show that we still believe and have chosen a side.